The Cutter cabin had been empty for 2 weeks. The chimney was still smoking. The fire should have gone out in October. Silas Pratt noticed it on the morning of November 12th, 1868, when he came down the ridge trail past the Cutter property on his way to the lower hollow. The chimney was producing smoke, not the thin wisp of a dying fire, not the flat gray of damp wood catching, but the steady dark column of a fire that had been going long enough to have the flue hot and drawing well. He stopped on the trail and looked at it. The Cutters had left on the 29th of October. He had watched them go, the wagon loaded with the household goods, Daniel Cutter driving, his wife May beside him, the 3 children settled in the bed behind with the quilts and the kitchen boxes and the brass lamp that May had insisted on taking because it had been her mother's and she was not leaving it in an empty cabin. They were moving south, 2 days' journey, to be nearer May's mother, who had taken ill in September and who needed more care than letters could provide. The move was not permanent. Daniel had said he would be back in the spring, but it was 2 days south in October, and that was a real distance in the hollow's geography. The cabin had been standing empty for 2 weeks. Silas stood on the trail and looked at the smoke and thought. Daniel came back for something. He noted it and kept walking. He had his own mourning to attend to, but on his return trip 2 hours later, the smoke was still rising. If you find yourself drawn to places like this, quiet and not quite empty, consider subscribing. There are more waiting. He stopped on the trail and looked at it. The same quality, steady, dark, a fire that had been going for a while. Not the first smoke of someone building a morning fire, which started thin and gray and thickened as the wood caught. This was the smoke of a fire already established. He had seen it this morning, and it was still going. 2 hours was a long time for a man who had come back for something to still be in a cabin. He stood on the trail and thought about whether to go up to the door and knock. He decided against it. Daniel's business was Daniel's business. He walked on. The fire kept burning, but he looked back twice. That evening, sitting at his own fire, he thought about the smoke. He thought about what it took to keep a fire going in an Ozark hollow cabin in November. You didn't bank a fire and walk away from a cabin for 2 weeks and come back to find it burning. A banked fire held coals for 8 to 12 hours, sometimes a bit longer in a deep firebox with good ash insulation. After that, it went cold. You came back to a cold cabin, and you rebuilt the fire from scratch with whatever wood you had left. Daniel Cutter had been gone for 2 weeks. He thought about whether there was any version of the last 2 weeks that produced a smoking chimney on the morning of November 12th. He couldn't find one, not from a banked fire. That was impossible. From someone coming back, maybe, but Daniel's business was his mother-in-law, and he had said he was staying through winter, and more to the point, if Daniel had come back, he would have answered the door. He thought about the smoke. He thought about the fire he had heard through the door, the specific sound of a fire that was going, not catching, not dying, going. He thought about the warmth that had come off the door when he put his hand against it. He thought, I'll go look in the morning. He did not sleep especially well. In the morning, he went. The Cutter cabin sat on the south-facing slope of the West Ridge, a good position, sheltered from the north, catching the winter sun on its front face, the specific orientation of a man who had thought carefully about cold weather when he built. Daniel Cutter had been in the hollow for 9 years when Silas arrived, and the cabin reflected those 9 years. Sound, well chinked, the fieldstone hearth he had laid himself over 2 summers, the chimney draw that people commented on when they visited. A fire in that hearth never struggled for air. The chimney was producing smoke when Silas arrived. He stood at the yard's edge for a moment and looked at it. Not the thin trace of a fire's end. A real column, dark and steady, the smoke of a fire with a hot flue behind it. He walked to the door. He knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. From inside came the specific sound of a fire in a good hearth, the low crackling of wood combustion, the occasional settle of shifting coals, the draft moving through the flue. He had been listening to fires and hearths all his life, and he knew a fire that was going from a fire that was dying, and this was going. He tried the latch. The door held. The interior bar was down, thrown from inside. He stood on the step and thought about this. The bar was down and Daniel was not, answering, and the fire was going. He found a stick and used the gap at the top of the door frame, the old trick, and the bar lifted and the door swung open. The warmth came out at him. Not residual warmth, not the tepid memory of a fire that had burned days ago. The specific full warmth of a room that was being heated now, that had been heated long enough that the air held the temperature uniformly, wall to wall, ceiling to floor. He stood in the open doorway and felt it on his face and on the backs of his hands. The hearth held a good fire. Moderate, steady, not stoked for a cold night, not banked for a warm one. The specific fire of a room being maintained at a comfortable temperature. The fire of someone who knew what they wanted from a hearth and had it. The wood in the firebox burned with even combustion. Good coals showing red at the base, the flames low and consistent. He looked at the room. Empty. The furniture the Cutters had left. The heavy table, the bench, the sleeping platform frame, the chair Daniel had decided not to carry, stood in its places under a thin, even film of dust. The hooks where coats had hung were bare. The shelf where May kept her kitchen things was bare. The floor showed no footprints in the dust. No one had walked in this room since the day the Cutters swept it and left. He looked at the fire. The fire kept burning. He stood in the doorway for a long time without entering, feeling the warmth on his face, looking at the empty room and the going hearth and the dust on the floor that showed no feet. And then he turned around and walked to Nathan Webb's farm. Nathan Webb had been in the hollow since 1851, 17 years, and was the person the hollow went to when something needed to be thought through carefully. He was 54 years old, precise by temperament, with the quality of attention that made him useful in exactly this kind of situation. The situation where the evidence required someone to look at it steadily and say what it actually said, rather than what would be comfortable. He came to the Cutter cabin with Silas that afternoon. He went through the door first, which was his habit. He liked to receive the evidence before the person telling him about it could shape his reading of it. He stood in the doorway. He felt the warmth. He looked at the empty room and the going fire and the undisturbed dust and the bare hooks on the wall. Then he stepped inside and began examining things systematically. The firebox first. He crouched at the hearth and looked at the wood supply, the burning wood, the coals. He looked at the ash bed. He pressed his hand near the hearth opening and measured the heat output against his experience of fire heat in a room this size. How long since they left? 2 weeks tomorrow, Silas said. Nathan looked at the ash. The ash in a hearth that had been burning for 2 weeks accumulated to a specific character, layered, compacted, the dense deposit of sustained combustion. This ash was lighter than that. The quantity suggested 2 or 3 days of burning, not 14. It hasn't been burning the whole time. Then how is it still lit? Nathan looked at the wood remaining in the firebox. The supply hasn't been replenished. This is what Daniel left. He took out his notebook. I want to measure the quantity. He did, carefully, noting the stack height and the approximate volume, and recording his best estimate of the supply remaining. He would need comparison points. He went through the rest of the cabin without touching anything. The floor dust was undisturbed. He moved carefully, stepping in the margins, keeping his own tracks distinct. No other footprints. The windows were intact. The latch had been thrown from inside before Silas opened it. The chimney cap sat in place above. No one has been in this cabin. No. He looked at the fire. The fire is going. The fire is going, Silas said. They stood in the warm, empty room and held the account. It had the same gap in it that all the Hollow's unusual accounts had. The space between what was present and what should have been present. The space that neither of them could fill with anything they knew. Nathan went back 4 days later and checked the wood supply. He had marked it on his first visit. A specific piece of charcoal scratched across the face of the woodpile at the current surface level, so he could see at a glance how far the pile had dropped. He had also counted the cut lengths and estimated their collective volume, a rough calculation, but consistent. The mark showed the pile had dropped about 2 inches in 4 days. He stood and calculated. A fire of that size and heat output burned roughly 1 cut, length every 2 hours of active burning. 4 days of active burning, even accounting for the fire running lower at night, should have dropped the pile by 8 to 10 inches. It had dropped 2. He checked the fire. It was burning at its usual moderate level. He held his hand near the hearth and felt the heat output, consistent with a fire that was burning actively, not smoldering. Normal heat from a fire that was consuming wood at less than normal rate. He came back a week after that. The pile had dropped another 2 inches. 7-inch drop in 11 days of burning. The expected drop for 11 days was somewhere between 20 and 25 inches. He sat beside the fire for a while and thought about what he was measuring. He was measuring a fire that produced the heat of a normal fire and consumed wood at roughly 1/4 to 1/3 the rate of a normal fire. He could think of no mechanism that produced this result. He had burned wood in hearths for 30 years, and he knew what wood consumption looked like, and what he was measuring was not that. He wrote in his record, "The fire in the Cutter cabin is consuming wood at approximately 1/4 to 1/3 the expected rate for a fire of its apparent size and heat output. I have verified this with 3 measurements over 11 days. The pile shows steady, but anomalously slow depletion. I have no explanation. I am recording the measurements and will continue." The Hollow heard about the Cutter fire within a week of Silas's first discovery. Because information moved in the Hollow the way it always moved, and because several people had occasion to pass the Cutter property and had noticed the chimney smoke and had gone to investigate on their own. What each of them found was what Silas had found: the warm room, the going fire, the empty cabin, the undisturbed dust. Will Cord went on a Tuesday morning in mid-November and spent 20 minutes inside and came back saying it was the warmest room he had been in all autumn, warmer than his own house with his own fire going. He said this without suggesting it was strange. A warm room was a warm room, but he said it with the slight hesitation of a man who knew it was worth noting. His wife Sarah went Thursday and stayed longer. She said the fire had a quality she recognized from her parents' house when she was a child, the quality of a fire that someone had been minding for years, that had been tended through enough seasons to know what it was doing. "It's not a new fire," she said. "I don't know how that's possible, but it doesn't burn like a new fire." Margaret Gear was the first to stay a full hour. She went on a cold afternoon in the 3rd week of November, after her husband, Thomas, had told her about Nathan's measurements, and she let herself in and sat in Daniel's chair. She said afterward it was the most comfortable hour she had spent that November. Not just warm, comfortable in the specific way of a room that was being actively tended. A fire in an occupied room had a different quality than a fire in an empty room, and she knew the difference because she had spent enough time alone in her own house, while Thomas was in the field, to know what a tended fire felt like versus an untended one. The Cutter fire felt tended. It felt as though someone had stepped out briefly and would be back. "Did it change while you were there?" Nathan asked when she told him. "It went up a little. 20 minutes or so after I arrived, burned a bit brighter, as though it had been given more air." She paused. "Or more reason." Nathan wrote this down. Old Pratt went the following week after dark, the only one who had done that. He went in the evening with his own lamp and sat by the fire for 2 hours. He came back and said the fire knew he was there. Nathan asked what he meant. "It went up when I came in, dropped when I moved toward the door to leave." He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without embellishment. The change was small, but it was there. A draft from the door. I've opened and closed many doors beside many fires. He looked at Nathan. This was different. Nathan added this to his record alongside Margaret's observation and held the two accounts together. He had been thinking about what Margaret said. More reason, since she said it. He had been thinking about it the way he thought about all observations that came from a reliable person and resisted easy restatement. Carefully, without discarding the word, just because it was strange. A fire did not have reasons. A fire was combustion, wood, heat, air, in specific proportions, producing specific outputs. It did not have reasons. And yet, the two accounts were consistent. The fire increased when someone was present, not when the door opened. Old Pratt had been clear that this was different from a door draft response. When someone was present and settling in. When someone was there in the way a person was there when they intended to stay. He decided the word reason was Margaret's interpretation, and that the fact underneath it was simply this. The fire was larger in company than alone. He recorded the fact. He did not record the interpretation. He went himself the following evening. He let himself in and stood in the doorway for a moment before entering fully, taking the fire's measure from the threshold. Moderate, steady, the same level it held on his afternoon visits, the level it maintained when the cabin was empty. He stepped inside and closed the door. He sat in Daniel's chair with his notebook open on his knee, and he watched the fire. For the first several minutes, nothing changed. He noted this, the fire at its baseline level, no response. He wondered if he had misread Margaret's account, or old Pratt's, or if the response required a longer presence to register. Then the fire went up. Not a surge, not a flare. The steady increase of a fire burning at a modestly higher rate. The kind of change that would have been invisible if you weren't watching for it. He watched the coals brighten slightly, the flames rise perhaps 2 inches. The quality of the heat in the room increased perceptibly over the following minutes. He put his hand toward the hearth and noted the change in output. He recorded the time, approximately 8 minutes after arrival. He stayed for an hour. The fire held at its increased level throughout. He tested this by sitting still in the chair, then by moving around the room, then by sitting again. The fire did not respond to his movement within the room. only to his presence in it. When he stood to go and moved toward the door, the fire dropped back. He stopped with his hand on the latch and turned and looked at the hearth. The fire was returning to its baseline level, the same steady, moderate burn he had found on arrival, the level it maintained alone. He stood in the doorway and watched it drop. He thought, it knows the difference between a person arriving and a person leaving. He went home and sat with his notes for a long time, and what he sat with was not the measurement. The measurements were clear and consistent, and he trusted them, but the quality of what he had observed, a fire that registered arrival and departure, a fire that burned higher in company and lower alone, a fire that was, in whatever sense the word applied to combustion, attending to the room it was in. He could not explain this. He wrote in his record, "I have now observed the fire's response to presence on 3 visits, and I am satisfied that the observation is reliable. The fire increases within approximately 5 to 10 minutes of a person entering the cabin and returns to its baseline level when the person leaves. I have no mechanism to propose for this behavior. I am recording it as observed." The cabin became, for several weeks, a gathering place. The hollow was small enough that a warm room with a fire going, and no one in it constituted a kind of resource, and the specific resource it constituted in a cold November was warmth. People began stopping at the Cutter cabin on their rounds through the hollow, letting themselves in, sitting by the fire for 20 minutes or an hour, and then going on with their day. This happened without formal discussion. It accumulated, the way habits accumulated in small communities, by people doing what seemed reasonable, and others doing the same. 3 families on the West Ridge used it regularly. Clara Pratt brought her mending twice a week and worked by the fire for an hour before the walk back. The Webb children stopped in on their way to the lower hollow for water, and their mother stopped in after them when she found out. Elias Birch, who was 71 and who felt the cold in a way younger people didn't, took to spending his mid-morning there on days when the temperature dropped below 20, walking the quarter-mile from his own place, sitting for an hour or 2, walking back in time for dinner. Nobody brought wood. This was noted privately by several people, that they were warming themselves at a fire they were not feeding, and that the fire did not seem to need feeding. The pile diminished on Nathan's charcoal mark scale, but slowly, and the fire continued. It was Thomas Gear who first said what was happening. "We're using a dead man's fire." Margaret looked at him. "Daniel's not dead," she said. "He's gone, and his fire is going." Thomas set down his cup. "It's his wood. It's his hearth. He banked it and left, and it's still going, and we're all sitting beside it. We walk over there in the cold, and we let ourselves in, and we sit beside his fire and warm ourselves, and we don't ask what's keeping it lit. He said he was coming back in the spring. It'll be out by spring." He looked at the fire in their own hearth. "Won't it?" Neither of them answered that. Neither of them could answer it. The hollow had no formal position on whether it was right to use the Cutter fire. There was nothing wrong with it in any practical sense. Daniel had said he was coming back, and the cabin was standing, and a fire that was going was a fire that could be sat beside, and the hollow was cold. The practical case was sound. The other case, the one Thomas was making without quite making, was harder to name. It had to do with the specific quality of a fire that was not yours in a house that was not yours, and that had been burning without anyone to tend it for weeks before you arrived. The visits to the cabin continued through December. What changed was their quality. The comfort that Margaret had described in November, the tended feeling, the sense of something actively maintained, began to shift in ways that were difficult to name. but that several people mentioned independently. Clara Pratt, who had been going to the cabin 2 or 3 times a week with her mending, said she stopped going in January because the cabin had started to feel different. Not cold. The fire was still burning, still warming the room, but the quality of the warmth had changed. It used to feel like someone's home, she said. In November, it felt like Daniel had just stepped outside. In January, it felt like a place that had been trying to feel like a home and was running out of the thing that made it feel that way. Old Pratt agreed with his daughter-in-law, though he used different language. He said the fire in January had the quality of a fire that was maintaining itself without purpose. In November, it had been burning toward something. In January, it was burning because it hadn't stopped. Nathan recorded both observations. He added, "The fire has not gone out in 3 months. The wood supply, by my measurements, is approximately 1/2 what it was when I first measured it in November. A normal fire burning at normal rate for 3 months would have consumed 3 to 4 times what has been consumed. The fire is either burning at an abnormally low rate or burning intermittently in a way I have not been able to observe. The room temperature on each of my visits has been consistent, between 52 and 58 degrees with no fire adjustments, suggesting the output is stable even if the consumption is not." He wrote, "I cannot account for this fire. I have checked the structure, the flue, the firebox, all normal. The fire burns at below normal consumption rates and responds to human presence by increasing, and I do not have a physical explanation for either of these behaviors." By February, the visits had stopped. This happened gradually and without discussion, the way the visits had started. People simply finding that their rounds no longer brought them past the Cutter cabin, or finding that when they did pass, they did not feel inclined to go in. Clara Pratt had been among the most regular visitors through November and December, going 2 or 3 times a week with her mending. She stopped in January. When Nathan asked her about it, she was honest. The cabin had started to feel different. Not cold, the fire was still burning, but the quality of the warmth had changed. In November it felt like someone's home, she said. In January it felt like a place that had been trying to feel like a home and was running out of the thing that made it feel that way. Elias Birch stopped going in late January, without saying why. His daughter mentioned it to Nathan, that her father had said the cabin was fine, but that he had started going a different way on his morning walk, the longer way that didn't pass the Cutter place. He was 71 years old and had been in the Hollow for 40 years and had seen most things it produced. He didn't offer an explanation for the route change, and his daughter didn't press him. The Webb children stopped going when their mother stopped sending them. By the first week of February, the cabin's visitors had reduced to Nathan, who was documenting it, and Thomas Gear, who made what turned out to be the last organized visit in the 3rd week of the month. Thomas stood inside for 15 minutes and came back out. He told Nathan, "The fire is there. The room is warm. I didn't want to stay." What was wrong? Nothing I can name. The fire was going. The room was the right temperature. He thought for a moment. "I've sat in cold rooms, and I've sat in warm rooms, and this was a warm room that felt cold. Not in temperature, in the way a room felt. The room no longer feels like a room that's meant to have people in it," Thomas said. "It feels like a room that's waiting for something, and I didn't want to be what it was waiting for." Nathan went himself the following day and sat in Daniel's chair for 30 minutes. The fire went up when he entered, held while he sat, dropped when he moved toward the door. It was doing exactly what it had always done. The behavior was unchanged, but the quality of the room had changed. He could not measure it or write it in his notebook the way he wrote wood consumption rates and room temperatures. It was felt, the specific way a space registered in the body of a person sitting in it, below the threshold of measurement, but above the threshold of perception. He sat in Daniel's chair and looked at Daniel's fire and thought about what a cabin was. A cabin was a held space, not held the way a cup held water, held the way a community held its shape through the ongoing effort of the people in it. The warmth of a cabin was not just the heat of the fire. It was the specific combination of fire and human presence. The warmth of a fire tended by someone who cared about the room staying warm. The warmth of a space that was lived in and meant to be lived in. This cabin had been trying to hold that quality since October. The fire was doing its part. It had been doing its part faithfully for 4 months, maintaining the temperature, responding to visitors, producing the warmth that a room required. It had done this without anyone to tend it, without anyone to feed it or bank it at night or build it up on cold mornings. It had been doing the work of an occupied cabin with none of the occupation, and it had done it well. Through November, it had felt like Daniel's house. Through December, it had felt like a cabin where someone lived. Into January, it had begun to feel like a cabin that was trying to feel like those things. And now, in February, the trying was showing. Nathan thought about what May would find when she came back in the spring. The hearth cold, the wood diminished but not exhausted, the room that had held itself for a winter and then let go. He thought about whether she would know what the cabin had done. He thought she probably wouldn't, and he thought that was probably right. Some things were worth knowing, and some things were worth letting lie. He put his notebook away. "You've done well," he said to the fire. The fire burned at its steady low level, unresponsive in the way of things that did not hear. He went home. The fire went out sometime in March. Nathan checked the cabin on March 8th and found the fire burning, the room at its usual temperature. He checked on March 19th and found the fire out, the hearth cold, the coals ash, the room at the ambient temperature of an unheated cabin in mid-March, which was 41 degrees. The wood in the firebox had perhaps 2 days' worth of burning left, if the fire had been burning at normal rate, though Nathan suspected it had been burning at its slow rate until it simply stopped. He looked at the cold hearth and the remaining wood and the ash. He wrote, "Fire out as of some time between March 8th and March 19th. Approximately 4.5 months from the cutter's departure. Wood remaining, in the firebox, enough for 2 to 3 days of normal burning. Original supply estimate at my first measurement, sufficient for 3 to 4 weeks of normal burning. Consumption over 4.5 months was approximately what I would expect for 3 to 4 weeks of normal burning." He wrote, "The fire burned for 4.5 months on a 3 to 4 week wood supply. I cannot account for this." He wrote, "The cabin is now as it should have been since October, empty, cold, the hearth dark. Whatever had been maintaining the fire has apparently finished maintaining it." He wrote, "I do not know what was maintaining it." He sat with that sentence for a moment. He had written versions of it all winter, at the end of each visit's notes. "I cannot account for this, and no explanation available and mechanism unknown." He had a careful man's resistance to claiming more than he could support, and claiming an explanation required supporting it, and he had none to support. What he had was this: a fire that should have gone out in November was going in March. A fire that burned at a quarter of its expected consumption rate. A fire that increased when people entered the room and decreased when they left. A fire that the hollow had been warmed by through the worst of winter, until the warmth began to feel like something else, and the hollow stopped coming. And then it stopped. He wrote, "I will note that May's mother died in February, which is approximately when the character of the cabin changed for those visiting it. Whether this is relevant, I cannot say. I am noting the timing. He sat in the cold cabin for a while. Daniel's chair was there. The table was there. The sleeping platform frame. The same furniture as always, dusted now with the full accumulation of 5 months of vacancy, rather than the 2 weeks' dust Silas had found in November. The hearth was cold. The room had the quality of a room that had stopped trying. He went home. The Cutters did not return in the spring as Daniel had planned. A letter came in April from May's cousin, who handled the family's correspondence, saying that May's mother had died in February and that Daniel had decided to stay south through another winter. The family needed time. He would write again when plans were settled. He did not know about the fire. Nathan read the letter. It had been passed around the hollow in the way that relevant news was passed, and he sat with it for an evening. He thought about what it meant that May's mother had died in February, which was when the visits to the cabin had stopped feeling comfortable, which was when Clara Pratt had described the warmth as running out of the thing that made it feel like home. He did not know whether these things were connected. He noted the timing. He thought about writing to Daniel. He thought about what the letter would say, that his hearth had stayed lit for 4.5 months after he left, burning on a 3-week wood supply, warming visitors through November and December, and then changing quality in January until the hollow stopped coming. He thought about whether Daniel needed to know this. He decided it was not information that would help Daniel in any practical way. The fire was out. The cabin was cold. Daniel's business was his family and his grief and his decisions about the South. He kept his notes. He had a full winter's worth of measurements and accounts, and he kept them in the same journal he kept everything in, the same handwriting, the same level tone. An anomalous fire in a neighbor's cabin documented alongside the grain prices and the frost dates. He thought this was probably the right way to keep it, alongside the ordinary record of a life, not set apart from it as something singular. The spring came, and the hollow farmed, and the summer was a good one for the ridge crops, and the autumn arrived in its usual way, and the Cutter cabin stood empty on its south-facing slope through all of it. Nathan walked past it regularly, on his way to the south fields. Sometimes he stopped and looked at the chimney. Cold throughout. The chimney that had smoked all winter was quiet in every season after, and he noted this each time he stopped, the ordinary absence of smoke from a chimney that had no reason to smoke. In November of 1869, a year to the month after, Silas had first noticed the smoke. Nathan went to the cabin and let himself in. Cold. The hearth was cold, the room at outdoor temperature, the ash in the firebox settled and old. The wood remaining in the box had not been touched. He estimated it at the same approximate level he had recorded in March when the fire went out. Perhaps 2 to 3 days' worth at normal burning rate, the diminished remainder of the original supply. He sat in Daniel's chair in the cold room and looked at the cold hearth. He thought about the 4.5 months. He thought about what the fire had been trying to do, and how well it had done it, and what it had cost. Not in wood, which was barely diminished, but in whatever it was that had sustained it, which was now gone. He thought about how it had felt in November, when Margaret had sat here and called it the most comfortable hour of her autumn. He thought about how it had felt in February, when Thomas had stood for 15 minutes and not wanted to stay. He did not have an explanation for any of it. He had gotten used to not having one. He had the measurements, and he had the accounts, and he had the specific texture of sitting in this cold room and knowing what it had been 4 months ago and what it was now. And those things together were what the hollow had in place of an explanation. He thought. It held the cabin as long as it could. He thought about what holding had cost it. Not the wood, which was barely gone, but whatever else it had drawn on across those 4.5 months. He did not know what that was. He did not have a word for it. He had the measurements and the accounts and the cold room and the empty hearth and Daniel's chair, which he was sitting in, and that was the sum of it. He put his notebook away and went home. He looked at the cold hearth. He thought. It held the cabin as long as it could. He thought, and then it stopped. He went outside and latched the door behind him, and walked back down the ridge trail toward the hollow, and the cabin stood on its south-facing slope behind him. Cold now, the chimney dark, the hearth as it should have been 5 months before, when the Cutters locked the door and drove south and left it to its own holding, which had been, as it turned out, considerable, which had been, as it turned out, more than anyone had expected from a banked fire and a closed cabin and a winter in the Ozark hills. The hollow did not talk about the Cutter fire much in the years after. It was in Nathan's record, carefully documented, available to anyone who wanted to read it. The measurements were there, the consumption rates, the temperature readings, the charcoal mark drops on the woodpile. The accounts were there, Margaret's first hour, old Pratt's evening visit, the fire going up when someone entered and dropping when they left. What was not in the record was the quality of it. The way Margaret had called it the most comfortable hour of her autumn. The way Clara Pratt had described it running out of the thing that made it feel like home. The way Thomas Webb had stood in the warm room and not wanted to stay. Those things were in the record as Nathan had written them, in quotation, as reported speech. But the thing they were pointing at was not something a record could hold. The Cutters came back in the spring of 1870, 2 years after they had left. Daniel walked through the cabin on the first day, checking the structure, and found it as expected. Sound, cold, the furniture dusty, the hearth with its ash and its remaining wood. He noted the wood remaining and thought it seemed light. He had left a fairly full supply, but he had been gone a long time, and his memory of what he had left was not precise. He built a fire. He did not think about the hearth in any particular way after that. It was his hearth. He had built it himself over 2 summers, and it drew well, and he was glad to be back in front of it. He did not know what the fire had done while he was gone. Nobody told him, but not, in the end, enough. These are stories from the edges of the recorded world.